You're listening to VerySpatial Podcast, episode 727, November 26th, 2023.
Hello and welcome to our VerySpatial Podcast. I'm Jesse.
I'm Sue.
I'm Barb. And this is Frank.
And this week, stick around for a little bit of Egyptology in our interview. But first, of course, some news. We're going to highlight the fact that Google up and changed maps.
Everything. They changed everything for no reason. They just did it. It was like, oh, by the way, this is different. And you're like, what?
Apparently, there was a beta. Nobody told us there was a beta. Clearly, it was not. They're not like interested in telling this geospatial people.
No, they're like,
yeah.
It was like that. And you're like, what? I'm sorry, did I hear you? What hell? Everything's different.
But it's not bad. It's actually kind of nice. It's different.
I think it's kind of like almost like an inverse topo map because it's got that green like a topo, right? But it has white for the urban areas.
You mean like a topo?
Huh?
You mean like a topo?
No, the topos that I'm used to have the red, like the red tint.
Yeah, the sort of salmony color. That's what.
Yeah.
Oh, for the heavy urban areas. Okay.
Yeah. Well, even it has a. I think it has a gradient depending on the size of the urban area, but I'm not sure if there's any white. I don't know. I haven't looked in a while, but that's what it's kind of like that, except for it's white for urban areas, which I don't.
So populated places on topos are white, but you're right. Incorporated areas of a certain size, maybe. I don't remember what creates the red, but
the reason I know this is my colleague actually did the research for this. He we did this at the tech center originally. It was a grant that was done like 10 years ago that we played around with colors, and then the USGS was like, we like it, and then it went through a bunch of people, and then they did it.
There you go.
A little bit of history there. But
now Google has done stuff, and if you're not just looking at the imagery but looking on the roadmap, yeah, that happened. There are other things that they're really highlighting for the holiday season. Let's see, things like the updates to transit route recommendations, updates to the being able to do lists and do more collaboration within lists of locations, emoji reactions to pictures and places, I guess.
It doesn't feel like something that I was really asking for in mapping.
Eco-friendly routing. No, eco-friendly routing and more ways to find charging stations.
That one I agree with 100%. I'm into that. It's the emojis on places. It's just, I don't know.
Save money on gas so you can spend more on holiday cheer. So looking at gas prices, avoiding tolls, which you could already do, but I guess it's a little easier. So,
okay, so anybody on the Google Maps team that's listening to this, I assume they all listen. This is my free idea. Okay, so what I want for driving directions is I want to be able to, like, places that that I know about. I want to start the trip from essentially a branching point from there. So basically, I don't want to hear turn out of my driveway and take a left down my road and take a right or left or whatever, because I know that I drive that every single day that I drive. I'm driving that route. You need to tell me that route. What I want to know is I want to say, it should say drive to Steve's house. Okay. And then at some point along Steve's house, okay, now you need to deviate. That's what I want. That's what I want in my driving directions. Free idea. You can have it.
Or anybody else that does maps and map directions.
Right. I mean, it's drive to work. Okay. But, a little bit, okay, you're going to change up here. Oh, okay, great. I get it. Just, it knows that I know how to get out of my neighborhood. Don't give me directions for that.
Okay.
Next up.
Also, yes, next up. So until I moved down here to the south, I never thought about this particular thing, which is our next map. And that is plants don't grow in the same places, right? Yes, it's stupid. But for years, I came from the north and I never really thought about it, that plants like different zones. So why is this important? Because the USDA has, in fact, updated their Plant Hardiness Zone map. And this is the map that tells you what zone you're in, obviously, and based on that, what kind of plants like it and what plants maybe don't, so that, you can help. And you might think, well, that's not a huge deal, but turns out it is for certain plant species, and especially if you're growing gardens or growing certain types of plants that don't necessarily, for example, like too much heat or too much cold. So this is an update, and it actually does show that temperatures are warming And so some of the zones are changing. So that is actually, I don't know, I thought it was kind of interesting. Because again, something I didn't have to learn about till I moved down where it's stupid hot in the summer and doesn't really get cold in the winter.
I like the quote where the person said that, it's a gardener that said, okay, I know I'm not crazy. Because, you notice these things before the map changed. And when you go in to buy seeds, you use the USDA hardiness map a lot of times to select what seeds you're going to get, especially if you do something like I do wildflowers. And they also have certain places that won't send you certain seeds. Depending on the hardiness zone or certain plants, where they'll send it at certain times. So it's really helpful that it's been updated, because you had certain places that wouldn't send you bulbs or things during certain times of the year, and this will change that.
Yeah, that was another thing I didn't know either, too, is that there were places, especially online, that were like, no, we're not going to sell you that because it won't grow where you live. I'm like, what do you mean? I made it grow. So, yeah, anyway, so something you might not think about.
So something I think is interesting, if you go to the interactive map, it's in the link in the in the link in the show notes. There is a link to the interactive map, and they're using grid scales, which is not a big shock there whatsoever. I'm guessing, eyeballing it, maybe 1K, 1K. Anyway, I'm guessing what the grid cells are. But I think that the scale they used is a little, not scale, but the symbology they use is a little interesting. There's every color has like two, I'm going to say versions of it. It looks like, I don't know. It's not consistent. There's like a 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, 3A, 3B on down the line up to 13. And I'm not exactly sure. You'd have to dig a little harder to figure out exactly why A and B. I'm assuming there's a historical reason for this. And I'm assuming there's some sort of indication, if I actually bothered to read the document, that tells me what is an A and what is a B. But it's a little interesting.
And for those of you who are biologists out there laughing.
Yeah.
Just, yeah.
So SkyTruth, the company that does remote sensing for environmental conservation, looking for things like hazardous oil spills and other things going on worldwide, has updated their features to make it easier to use, cleaned up some layers, and given it more customizability, so that more people worldwide can access and use it to track and respond to environmental incidents, such as the California hazardous material spills, Texas oil and gas drilling permits. In the UK, they're looking for gas spills at sea. They also look for illegal fishing and also human slavery at sea on fishing vessels. So there are a lot of things that they are looking at worldwide, these environmental alerts, these SkyTruth alerts, and they wanted to make it easier for the public to access and use the environmental incident data that they've been producing.
So the guy who started SkyTruth, he was one of the keynote speakers for one of our West Virginia Association of Geospatial Professionals annual meeting. His name's John Amos. Fun fact, he got me into bourbon, actually, during one of the social things. We talked along about that. He's a really interesting guy, and it's worth checking out SkyTruth if you haven't had the opportunity, because he's kind of, he started in 2000, and one of his sort of philosophies is we can use this stuff for more than just federal government work. And, of course, we all know that. But again, 23 years ago, this was not necessarily as accepted utilization as it is today. And so I think he's done some interesting things. So if you haven't had an opportunity to mess around with SkyTruth or check them out, you really should check them out. Plus, I do very much appreciate that on their Our Team page, they do include all their pets. So, that's just an extra shout out.
That's it for the news. So we're happy to be joined today by Laura Ranieri Roy and Francois Roy. They are both Egyptologists with Ancient Egypt Alive and have recently started the Secrets of Egypt Revealed podcast. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to be here.
Just to kind of kick things off with a very broad question, since we, have talked to various historians and archaeologists, but never anybody who's specifically focusing on Egyptology. So can you tell us a little about Egyptology and where it fits within history, classics, archaeology, that's kind of combination of places that it pulls from and has helped to grow?
Well, it's interesting. Egyptology is a field that is really only 200 years old, and a lot of people date it from the time of a famous Frenchman, Jean-Francois Champollion. And it was actually 201 years ago that he published his paper there were other people who were making progress on cracking the code of the Rosetta Stone, but he was the first to publish. So from that time, we're dating, 1822, the mystery of hieroglyphic writing was kind of penetrated. And most historians will say that it was the advent of Egyptology, where it wasn't just, these mysterious symbols and treasure hunting in Egypt. You could actually piece together the story of this culture. So it's the language beyond archaeology. It's the study of all things Egypt.
Well, you can maybe get a counter argument out of that. It's the one that started it all was actually Napoleon Bonaparte. So he went to Egypt on his expedition. And of course, I think it's one of the opening scenes in a new film that's coming out from Ridley Scott. But he went to Egypt, and what he brought with him, he brought about 150 scientists with him. And I'm talking about people that did illustrators, surveyors, drawers, geographers, like Vival Denon,
yes,
as an example. And what they did is they did an ethnography that really broke new ground that even France didn't have. Is they documented everything about Egypt's present and its past, and biological too. So we have every millipede worm that is there, every fly, every wasp, every fish. They documented absolutely everything. And they published these series in a series of manuals known as Description de l'Égypte in several volumes, starting in 1808, 1809, and all the way through as Laura said, and really started something when the scientists brought these books back home, this Egyptomania, and of course this renewed study in trying to decipher the hieroglyphs. And this is where Jean-François Champollion on the French side, and there was an Englishman as well involved in that too, right?
Yeah. So they actually, Napoleon's army found that Rosetta Stone, which led to the translation. But this was a perfect storm of Egyptomania, and it was in the early 19th century that it really began.
Yeah, and I think as a follow-up to that, I think the Rosetta Stone is a great example, right, of an object. And if you see it, and we've actually, Jesse and I have been fortunate enough to actually visit the museum and see the Rosetta Stone in place. But it really is an object that when you see it kind of in that setting, you sort of are awed first by when look at the text and it seems so basic and so much that came out of it. But it's interesting that for us as geographers, right, that came out of a place and time. And it's been amazing in that short span, as you pointed out, for the beginnings of Egyptology. It's been amazing how much has been learned. But I mean, what are your thoughts on trying to go from, say, as an entree, an object like that, to really starting that journey to delve into what the rich life must have been in Egypt? Even during the time of the Rosetta Stone for those many thousands of years beforehand, but making that connection from an object, from a place and time, to that place itself.
You want to try?
Yeah, no, I was going to say but in your case, it was when you walked into the Egyptian Museum, the Akhenaten statue.
What really grabbed someone? So, connecting you to space and time. And, Sue, it's when you talk about Egyptology, it's so complex because 3,000 years, the civilization, right? There were so many different eras, the Old Kingdom, the Pyramid Age, the Civil War periods, the Intermediate periods, the New Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, which gets overlooked. So there's so much to talk about. When you talk about Cleopatra, she was 2,000 years after the building of the pyramids. They were old to her. So many objects, and they speak to different eras. For me, my first love, when I walked into the Egyptian Museum, oh my God, I was in my 20s, so 25 years ago, I saw this statue of Akhenaten, who's the weird revolutionary king who looked and ruled like no other, with the narrow cheekbones, wide hips. It was almost like he was the first gender fluid king. He portrays himself naked, with no genitalia in one of his statues. But he was so mesmerizing, and I started this journey. I went back to get my degrees, met the archaeologist. I just did a fundraiser for the archaeologist who's worked with the site of Akhenaten's kingdom for 40 years. But that object was one of the first that fascinated me. There's so many since that have grabbed me. And takes you to a time and place. That took me to this late New Kingdom of Egypt around 1330 BCE, just before Tutankhamun. This was his father. And this strange Amarna period, But then the pyramids also. I adore the pyramids. And every time I go in there and go around there, something new, just to be in the area of the pyramids is probably one of the most, talk about place. When you go to the site of the Giza pyramids or you go inside or around, it's probably the most touristed site in all of the world. If you think how many people, not just the pharaohs, that was a long time ago. Think of all the great people. Napoleon slept inside the pyramids. Every king and queen, every celebrity, every important person in history from the Roman emperors and the Greeks went through, they traveled to see the pyramids for thousands of years. So talk about a place that resonates with the march of history.
Well, and actually the tourism was in full swing with the early Romans, as an example. So, as an example, in front of the Sphinx, during the time of Nero, so we're talking in the 60s AD, they built a platform about 12 meters wide, a series of steps and a long platform, and that platform was there until the 1930s. And that platform was there for visitors to come and look at the Sphinx, more or less at eye level. And not only that, the Sphinx sits in a bit of a hollow, so it was frequently buried, I guess, up to its neck in sand. So this, as I said, this platform was there, tourism was there, the Colossi of Memnon and Luxor on the West Bank, as how many?
The little
100 pieces of graffiti.
Roman tourists,
Roman tourists. So Egyptian tourism 2,000 years ago, and that's something when we first started to study the field and look at the field, we didn't expect that. We thought it was, a fairly modern, I guess, phenomenon, considering that Egypt was more or less closed to the Western world before actually Napoleon's invasion.
I went through my phase of just being fascinated as well, and then other landscapes kind of also competed for my attention. But I think when I first read about the deciphering of the Rosetta Stone, but I thought about it, right? It's just an announcement that would have been, upright somewhere, and just thinking about the whole world around it as people walk by it and in its place, and then thinking about it, getting to see it after the fact. So that's why I was hoping absolutely that you would have a similar, object or something you saw that just kind of for you just made the whole picture in your mind, like what it must have been like.
The Rosetta Stone is one of the most boring artifacts. So
yeah, like it's actual thing, so but
it's like Ptolemy V, this boring decree about donations to the temples. I mean, it does say something about this fragment, tax cuts, but it's written in three texts. It's not, three texts, two languages. I mean, Egyptian and two different texts than in Greek, but it's so boring. Anyway, it's like and then we have a copy in the Royal Ontario Museum, and of course, Egypt wants it back. But just gorgeous works of art. There's beautiful pottery, there's beautiful statuary, there's amazing things. The Rosetta Stone's not in my top 100 list of favorite objects.
Yeah. Well, for me, it was more because of the story, right? That someone wanted to know. And then, that's like that.
Do you know the story? The French found it, one of Napoleon's army officials, and brought it. He got it to the savants, as they're called, these learned men in Cairo. But guess what was happening? The English had arrived in the bay, and but the savants took a copy of the Rosetta Stone. They copied it before it was seized by the English, who brought it back to England, and thus began a 20-year battle between the English and the French to decipher it. And there's a very smart man, Thomas Young, who was a polymath in England. Yes. He did as much as Champollion to get close to the decipherment. He made a lot of connections of names and different things. He did a lot. He doesn't get enough credit. Champollion gets all the credit. There's others. There's a Swedish guy who did a lot,
Yeah, but he gets credit because he when you do a puzzle, two people work on it, and the person that gets the final piece at the end. Oh, so this is where this goes. But it's not just that. It's Champollion learned Coptic, and this is now basically a dead language. It's only used in the liturgy in the Coptic Church, and it's as close as you can get to late Egyptian as a spoken language. So it's if you're in linguistics and things like that, this is it's very important that we have someone who actually, he wrote like a list between the hieroglyphs and the Demotic and the Greek, and how it was verbally pronounced phonetically. So that people like that really helped because they give it a bit of a broader scope. I think that's where the importance of the Rosetta Stone comes in, because he was able to mirror the hieroglyphs with Greek, which any learned person in the 19th century knew how to read and write.
With these connections to place, and not just the artifacts, but the temples, the pyramids, all different scales. We've got a lot of different things going on. As you mentioned, it's a very long period of time, and so whether we're talking about how we experience these places in Egypt, or the people themselves were experiencing them as they were being built, as later they were their own history. It's just exciting, of course, but just this cultural timeline of these places. And you talk about how kings and others are walking into the same places that Cleopatra and others would have walked, and then of course the predecessors when they were being built. But there's also these places that exist on the landscape that were important culturally but less visited. So places like the Valley of the Kings and others, where it was less about being as prominent and having people come as often there, but very much about being culturally important. So how do we, across time, across this valley of the Nile River, how do we understand these different cultural importances today?
So are you talking about the sites in Egypt that, the great march of tourists from Greece and Rome didn't beat a path to the door, the more sacred, the more hidden places in Egypt that maybe tourists are going to in the last 50 years, maybe, but they didn't traditionally go to?
Yeah, but they were still very much culturally important to the Egyptians, but
yes,
they remained so until, of course, more recently.
Well, I would say the Valley of the Kings would not be in that category because we have Graffito, the Romans and the Greeks. It was tourist sites for them. I'm just trying to think of something. You know what? He was just teaching last night about the Roman period, the late period, and there's a site I love to go to that is there's certain sites in Egypt that have an energy. And again, I'm an Egyptologist. I don't, but I'm also sensitive. I can be sensitive to some places. Definitely not the pyramids. I don't feel anything in there except there's just tons of people have been all over. But there's a monastery in the hills of Aswan. It's from the 4th to 6th century AD. The monastery of San Simeon. And you go up in camel up this, the desert hills in the early morning. This is what we do in our tours. And Christians are working there. And it's a fabulously preserved space. And, you don't think of these areas when you go to Egypt. You think of the pyramids, Valley of the Kings. But there's a site of early monasticism and early Christianity in the hills of Aswan that still resonates with this power and this energy and this, what a special place, this quiet in the hills there. And then around the bend from there are tombs that people didn't visit that are maybe discovered in the last 50 or 60 years, possibly, the Kabet al-Hawa, the tombs of the Old and Middle Kingdom of provincial officials, like the governors of the Aswan, the Upper Egyptian area. And they're really interesting little tombs. And they're a relatively, new, less touristic site, but it's very special. I find sometimes these more off the beaten path sites have a little magic of their own. And of course, they're finding new tombs. They're opening new tombs and new sites every year. So there's new places, even going to the fabulous Temple of Hatshepsut in Birabari. You weren't there in February, Francois, but they've opened up new rooms there. There's a Polish Egyptian team working on the great queen who would be king, this woman who ruled Egypt in 1400 BCE. And she built this beautiful terrace temple, and they're working on new rooms and new sites there. So you're entering spaces that have really not seen the light of day in thousands of years, too.
Yeah, and it's true. I guess as we get more and more into the field, but just different areas get we get more meaning out of it, and the Egyptians as well. It's an interesting point you brought up about the monastery of San Simeon. The Western tradition of monasticism and comes out of Egypt. This asceticism comes out of Egypt, and the development of the monastery in Western civilization. The East is separate. Buddhism and Taoism and all that development there from India to China. But Western monasticism developed on its own separately. It came out of Egypt, and this San Simeon, it started with these ascetics in caves, and they were called, the early hermits were called anchorites. One reason being is that in this particular case, I think he's called Amba Hatre, Amba Hatre. He would suspend himself. He would take a lock of his hair and suspend himself to the ceiling of the grotto, so he would not often fall asleep, as he was constantly in a state of prayer. So it's and of course a church gets built around this grotto and this cave, and then eventually we get the development of what we call cenobitic monasticism, which is your monasticism in a community. So this is a phenomenal site.
Yeah, it's cool.
With a church at the bottom, and then your classic monastery with the refectory and the cells on the upper level.
Yeah, and I think mentioning that site too is another question. And actually, we were able to chat just a little bit before we started recording on just the amazingly unique geography and landscape of the Nile itself, right? As the lifeblood, the lifeline for the Egyptian empire, for Egypt now. And the interesting thing about how and I think you would agree, or maybe you see more nuance to this, but when often people think of Egypt, right, they think of it as somewhat homogenous. And we already talked about the temporal, right, the time difference, where, when Cleopatra's here in the late era, you're already talking about the pyramids being thousands of years old, right, being archaeological sites to them. But I think also geographically, right, we have our core sets of sites near what is now Cairo, right, the mouth of the Nile, right, the Nile Delta. But you've got sites further upriver. I mean, we just talked about another one even further upriver than that. But just trying to, as you're bringing people to Egypt, and just giving that chance to explore it, explaining just how the geography itself, we don't necessarily think of it as regional, even though we would think of our own places as regional, right? The southern United States is different than the north. Quebec is certainly different in Canada than is, say Edmonton right out in the west. But it's interesting that I think that a lot of people don't realize that same regional difference is there, obviously, in what was a massive geography for Egypt.
Egypt is built, there's certain concepts that are absolutely central to understanding ancient Egypt. One of them is duality. And everything was the desert, Deshret, and Kemet, the red land and the black land. There was the Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, the lotus and the papyrus. So there was this constant struggle as well through Egyptian history. When you get to an intermediate period, the Upper and Lower Egypt tend to be divided. Upper is the south, lower is the north. It can be confusing because the Nile flows, for all your geography people obviously know this, flows up from Lake Victoria deep into Africa, and it flows north into the Mediterranean. So upper is the south. And anyway, so the kings also, define themselves. One of the key titles of the kings had 5 titles actually. One of the key ones was the king of Upper and Lower Egypt. And they would wear little hats. One of them looked a bit like a bowling pin. It's the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. But it was very important that they wore the double crown if they were truly king of the whole nation. So this division between north and south, desert and the black land, black meaning not Nubian, it means fertile regrowth, the black soil of Egypt is really what defines ancient Egypt and the core of the success of this 3,000-year-old civilization, this fertile black soil surrounded by desert, keeping the enemies out and keeping the people fed and healthy.
I was just going to add, part of the title was not just King of Upper and Lower Egypt, but it's Nebtawi, the Lord of two lands. So, and it also is reflected in the Egyptian language. Our languages has a singularity and plural, so single, anything more than one is plural. But Egyptian or ancient Egyptian, what we use the term Middle Egyptian, because that was the age of literature. They have three. So you have singularity, you have the double or biliteral, and then anything more than that is plural. So plural in the hieroglyphs, in ancient hieroglyphs, is shown as 3 vertical strokes. 3, not 2. So their concept, they have their concepts from religion and everything else is the duality. And so, yes, you have the Nile, that thin little thread that Herodotus called the gift, right? And then the delta, but there's also a little region right near the base, and it's a very important region, and it figures in the Middle Kingdom, and it figures in the Greco-Roman period, and it's called the Fayum. And the Fayum is a shallow freshwater lake, and it was a lot larger in the past. There's a different name for it now. I think it's called the Birket Harun or something like that. But it's fed. It's fed with a man-made canal or channel. I think the word channel is better suited. And it's called the Bar Yusuf, Joseph. And it's always been called that since. So where does the word Joseph comes from? So this is one of the enigmas that we deal with in ancient Egypt. And it was a central area of civilization in the Middle Kingdom when what we call Syro-Palestinians, when Semitic-speaking peoples were actually invited into Egypt at this time. So the geography could be seen as, okay, the delta and then the Nile as it goes through almost vertically. It's got a bit of a notch in it near Kenna, but where it goes east and west, right? But there's this area that's to the west of the Nile, just southwest of Cairo. It's called the Fayum.
It's really cool to go out to the Fayum, spend some time in this green area on the lake. It's very, very good sunset cruise. But here's what, take a look. You guys are geography experts. Take a look at the Nile and how it goes up and it empties in the delta into the Mediterranean. And can you think of the shape that it looks like? If you had a picture of the Nile in front of you somewhere, you would see it looks like a flower. It actually looks like a lotus. It's amazing how the geography corresponds to the great national flower of ancient Egypt.
To jump real quick to what's coming up for you, you're getting ready right now for your next trip into the region. So what is it you're planning on doing over the next couple of weeks?
Oh, well, we're taking Francois going to the Jordan portion, but I'll be going, I think it's my 16th trip. I'm losing count, but I take tours every year, small group culture tours through Egypt. They're fairly deluxe. Our travelers tend to be a little bit more mature. We don't do, backpacking 20-something trips. We do for mature travelers who like, and we do everything. We go to the sites of Cairo, the Islamic sites of Cairo, the Christian sites of Cairo, the markets, everything. Then we go down to Aswan. We take you have to take a Nile cruise to experience Egypt. They're riverboats. They're really nice. And you actually tour the Greco-Roman temples. Have you guys been? You tour the little temples as you go between Aswan and Luxor. It's wonderful. You must come with us someday.
It'll be great. That's one that we haven't. We've made it to Athens and Delphi and lots of great places in Greece, but haven't made it around the southern side of the Mediterranean yet. So,
if I can tell you, okay. And the other thing we do, which was go to Abu Simbel, which is the southernmost fascinating site close to the border of Sudan. We do it by road. It's really cool, and we'll have a Nubian lunch. The greatest temple ever built, and that's the one so striking. Had to be moved in every block in its entirety, further back and up when they built the Nile Dam so it wouldn't be flooded. Unbelievable. And you see some of the documentaries on this. A real wonder of the world. So those are the type of tours we take. But for people who are thinking of Egypt, it should be on everyone's bucket list. They're opening in the next couple of months. Inshallah, as the Egyptians say. We don't know if it's February or May. The Grand Egyptian Museum. Have you heard about this? Yes.
Just a little bit, though, but yeah.
Largest archaeological museum in the world has been being built over the last decade at the foot of the pyramids. All of the treasures, 5,000 years of history, actually, because Egypt goes on even a little more. And all of Tutankhamun's treasures together for the first time. They'll never tour anymore. It's going to be unbelievable when this museum opens its doors. And all this, it's great. I mean, they've come through the Arab Spring. It's 10 years after that. They've, now the war, and I'm hoping this next trip, Jesse and Sue, to show the world that Egypt is still a safe destination. It's kind of, people say, "You're going to Egypt. There's a war right now." It's like, yeah, it's like saying there's race riots in LA. You shouldn't go to Toronto. It's like different country. I don't think we're going to have an issue, but who knows? Everywhere in this world is unpredictable right now. That's the climate we live in.
Well, that'll be exciting. And I have to sneak in one last question for this time, and hopefully you'll be able to join us again on a future episode.
I'd love to join you again, yeah.
But my question is, as Egyptologists, I mean, every time I look at the news, I mean, there's an exciting new discovery, right? It's just, we're learning so much and seeing so much. I mean, I think I was just looking at some reports, and these were last year, the year before, but the discoveries made at Heraklion, right? The submerged city and other places like that. And I was wondering, is there anything that you've seen recently that just really said that's an exciting new update, or things that you're people are working on that you're looking forward just the most to see what they're finding? I didn't know if you had any particular.
It's constant.
Yeah.
Francois bursting.
Oh, he is. Excellent.
No, I'll just try to keep it short.
Oh, that's okay.
I think our answers, or at least mine, are a little too long. There's some work that's being done. There's an area called Saqqara. This is the area where the earliest tombs are, and Djoser's the world's first building in stone, and this pyramid. But anyway, so only about half of that field has been looked at or examined. And so there are a couple of, I guess, pharaohs where we don't have a tomb or a resting place. And one of which, and this is a major one, his name is Huni. So we don't have anything for Huni, and he's from that period. And right now, and I think it's Zahi's team. Is it Zahi?
It's always Zahi.
I think it's Zahi.
It's always him.
No, but there's a lot of other. There's
Pharaoh.
I think that's a good one, yeah. Or he's So anyway, so he's been demoted a little bit, but in any case,
right. He's a good guy, though. He's done so much for Egypt.
Oh, he has.
He's a big personality, big ego, but then he's done enormous things. He's working in this area, Gizer El Mudir at Saqqara. He says he's looking for Huni, but they're finding a lot of Old Kingdom tombs. Unbelievable. So we're usually getting. It's funny, we're getting spoiled the last 5 years because there's tons of discoveries of new tombs, but it's like, for us Egyptologists, like, oh yeah, it's another Sayite tomb, which is 25th dynasty or Ptolemaic. It's like late period guys. They always crowded around the old sites. They're people from 600, 500 BCE. And it's like, another 100 mummies of the late period. But to find Old Kingdom and to find mummies, in the last couple of years, they found an Old Kingdom mummy, and there's research being done that dates back mummification processes further back than we thought. They were using resin and techniques. So there's a lot that science, and I know you guys are big into GIS. There's great archaeologists like Dr. Sarah Parchak who are using that technology to discover, to look and find new cities and new settlements. And it's very expensive to launch into an archaeology dig. So good to know where you're digging and if there's something underneath before you start, right? So we do a talk January 2nd. So we do a free Zoom talk, Secrets of Egypt Revealed, like of all the discoveries of the past year. But also check out our Secrets of Egypt Revealed podcast. But we like to do a discovery roundup. So maybe we can even join you in the early new year to talk to you about what's new.
We usually look at what's been happening in the last year.
So what are the best places, some of which you just mentioned, for people to find out more about what you guys are doing?
AncientEgyptAlive.com. And also if you go in your favorite podcast, whether you're doing Apple or you're doing Spotify, Secrets of Egypt Revealed podcast with Laura Ranieri Roy and Francois Roy. And if you go to ancientegyptalive.com, if you're interested in going to Egypt, we have very small group tours. We get sold out pretty fast, but we also do lots of courses. I'm doing a fundraiser for Egyptian animals on December 17th. Another cause I'm very passionate about is helping the present day animals of Egypt in a very hard environment.
And this, I don't know if you're referring to other sites as well. Like if the people are interested in what's happening, Kent Weeks.
Lots of great sites.
The Theban Mapping Project. You can just Google that. It's called the Theban Mapping. So you'll get areas on the West Bank, right, and the Valley of the Kings. There are a couple of sites dealing with the Major Giza Plateau. I think the AERA, as an example, that are doing that. And the other thing too is, they're going to celebrate their 100th anniversary, and I think they've changed the name, but it was the Chicago Oriental Institute.
Anyway, lots of good sites on Egyptology, but if you go to ancientegyptalive.com, that's where we live.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Francois and Laura, for taking the time to join us.
I have a question for you guys.
We have a question. All right.
What's your favorite thing in ancient Egypt or place? What's your favorite place or object?
I think I gave the object, but the place, I was always fascinated. I almost went into archaeology. I did my undergraduate at Duke, and I was going to do archaeology there until I discovered other things. But my favorite place is still reading about the Valley of the Kings. But just the search for the tombs, not so much Tutankhamun's tomb itself, but just the search for the tombs. So that's probably the place in terms of ancient Egypt that I found the most fascinating. Just the rediscovery of the tombs and just looking at the landscape there and thinking, there was some memory, but just how unassuming, right, the entrances of the tombs are now to have such cultural significance. So for me, it was always reading about Valley of the Kings.
They're continuing to look for tombs in the Western Valley and all over. They're up to KV 64 now. Or 65. I mean, they thought Tut was the last. They found about 3 since then.
Mm-hmm.
But there's other tombs of the nobles. They're called Theban tombs. So you'll see them numbered TT, and you'll see a number. So so there's vast fields, right? There's the Queen's Valley as well as the nobles. Mm-hmm. So a lot of work being done.
Mine is less about an object or a place and more an aspect of the time. And we think of Egypt as it is today, and it's hard for people to often look beyond that. But when Egypt began to become Egypt, it was a very different place. Yes, the Nile was still the lifeblood, but it was not the same environment. We were, closer to the last ice age. There was more green at that portion of the world.
Yes.
And it's what allowed there to be more communities and places that we look at them today and we're like, oh, that's just desert. At the time, that's one of the things that really gets me, is that how much of the environment was just so much more hospitable at the time than we think of it as today.
Well, I think we both have a quick comment. It's really interesting. He wants to talk about climate, but I'm just going to say, if you go to Egypt, Jesse, you go into the middle of the country outside Cairo, which is such a modern, I love Cairo though. You go and see the farmers and it's like, am I looking at an old kingdom tomb relief? When I'm looking out it, they're using the same tools. Mm-hmm. There's the water buffalo. There's the donkeys. There's all of this looks like the middle of a tomb from 4,000 years ago. The scene I would see, they're fishing, they're using shadoofs in the water. And sometimes the geography has really marked the culture that even after 4,000 years, some things haven't changed in Egypt at all. It can be really striking. They even have these festivals. They're more connected with a Muslim, a famous Muslim chief, whatever, in Luxor, but they replicate the great ancient festivals as well that take place every year. And it's like, oh, it's the same kind of traditions. Some things stay the same. And what were you going to say about the greener environment?
Very quickly, no, you're absolutely correct. The period before the Old Kingdom is called pre-dynastic, and there's different ages, the Badarian, the Naqada, and it's one of the areas that I'm fascinated with. We have ancient stone circles. We have dried up lakes called playas, as an example. Some were freshwater, some were saltwater. And during one of these periods, the Naqada too, and it shows in their earthenware, there must have been millions of flamingos, because there's evidence, and there's evidence in other locations like in Meroruka's tomb, that Egypt looked a little bit more like Kenya or Tanzania, which I've been. and including some of the animals that were there. And I'm talking about flamingos, great white pelicans, and there's animals in those tombs there that only exist today in Kenya and in Uganda. You have to go that far south. So yeah, it was a much, much greener period. It was, you're geographers, so you probably know about what we call the mid-Holocene climactic optimum, and then its collapse, right? Which was one of the factors for the collapse of the Old Kingdom. So I'm not going to go into that. So you know that already. But you see it in the tombs. You see it in the release of the animals that aren't there anymore. You're right. I love that early period myself.
Once again, thank you for joining us this evening. And we'll make sure to catch up with you as we get into the new year.
Oh, thank you so much, Jesse and Sue. It's been a pleasure. Always love talking about Egypt.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
On to the Events Corner. This week, of course, we want you to understand that events occur, except for, usually not in December. So these are things, like usual, they're a little bit later.
First up is Replaying Japan. That conference will be taking place August 19th through the 21st in 2024 in Buffalo and Rochester, New York. So in the upstate of New York.
Like both? Like you have to drive back and forth?
Yeah, they're
First 2 days are going to be conference-y at Buffalo, and then you go to a tech museum in Rochester for the last day. So you'll be bussed across. Yeah, about an hour and a half, maybe, depending on what side of the city's.
Yeah.
And if you're there, you can zip across the border if you're able to and go check out Niagara because it's only like 15 minutes from Buffalo. And IGC 2024 is taking place August 24th through the 30th in Dublin. The abstracts are due by January 12th if you're interested in going to that.
Of course, if you'd like us to add your event to the podcast, send us an email to podcast@veryspatial.com.
If you'd like to reach us individually, I can be reached at sue@veryspatial.com.
I can be reached at barb@veryspatial.com.
I can be reached at frank@veryspatial.com.
And I'm available at Kinda Spatial. And of course, you can find all of our things over at veryspatial.com/contacts. And a pre-New Year's resolution is to sometime in the new year get those updated on veryspatial.com/contacts.
As always,
we're the folks from Very Spatial.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you in a couple weeks.